Don't let him adopt me. A little girl's terrified scream shatters the courtroom. She clings to the judge's robe, her tiny hands trembling. The man before her, her foster father, looks devastated. Then, through sobs, she whispers, "Mama said not to trust him." But her mother is dead. Now the judge must uncover the truth before it's too late. Who is this man? And what dark secret has been buried in the past? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 3A, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The usual bustle of the courthouse had given way to an expectant hush as tiny Ava Mae Carter perched in her oversized chair. Her yellow dress, carefully chosen for this special day, made her look like a delicate flower against the dark wood of the courtroom furniture. Her small hands were folded neatly in her lap, just as her social worker had taught her. Judge Ethan Lawson sat at his bench, his weathered hands resting on the smooth surface before him. His keen blue eyes moved between the little girl and Daniel Garrett, who stood with barely contained nervous energy at the front of the courtroom. Garrett's strong hands, usually so steady during fire rescues, fidgeted with his tie. The morning's excitement had left creases in his freshly pressed suit, betraying hours of restless anticipation. The judge cleared his throat, his voice carrying through the silent room. "We are here today to consider the adoption petition of Daniel Garrett for Ava Mae Carter." He paused, looking down at the small child whose feet swung back and forth inches from the floor. Mr. Garrett has been Ava Mae's foster father since she was an infant, and now seeks to make this arrangement permanent. The words held the weight of years of careful nurturing and love. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as social workers and attorneys exchanged knowing glances. This should have been a routine hearing, a happy occasion marking the beginning of a forever family. The air was thick with anticipation and the promise of joy that usually accompanied these proceedings. Judge Lawson's expression softened as he addressed the little girl. "Ava Mae, sweetheart, are you ready to be adopted by Mr. Garrett?" His gentle tone carried years of experience in putting nervous children at ease. The silence that followed felt heavy, like a thick blanket settling over the courtroom. Ava Mae's small face, usually so bright and animated, froze in an expression of pure terror. Her brown eyes grew wide and her tiny body began to tremble. The yellow ribbon in her carefully braided hair quivered with her growing fear. Then came the scream, raw and primal, ripping through the quiet like a thunderclap. "Don't let him adopt me!" The words echoed off the walls as Ava Mae launched herself from her chair, her yellow dress fluttering like frightened wings. The sound of her patent leather shoes against the wooden floor echoed through the stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the child ran straight for Judge Lawson, her small hands reaching desperately for his black robe. She grabbed the fabric, holding on as if her life depended on it, her whole body shaking with sobs. The force of her movement knocked over the water pitcher on the judge's bench, sending it clattering across the surface. Daniel Garrett's face crumpled, the color draining from his cheeks. "Ava, sweetheart." His voice broke, the words catching in his throat like shards of glass. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture of helpless confusion. The morning light caught the tears welling in his eyes. The previously orderly courtroom dissolved into chaos. Lawyers whispered urgently to each other, papers rustling as they shuffled through documents. The stenographer's fingers hovered uncertainly over her keys. In the sudden commotion, the judge's assistant dropped her pen, the small sound somehow cutting through the noise like a gunshot. Someone near the back of the room let out a muffled sob. "Order!" Judge Lawson's voice boomed through the room. He looked down at the trembling child clinging to his robe, his stern expression melting into concern. "Ava Mae, what's wrong? You're safe here, sweetheart. Can you tell me what's frightening you?" His hand moved instinctively to protect her, as if shielding her from an unseen threat. The little girl's only response was to sob harder, pressing her tear-stained face into the judge's sleeve. When Garrett took another step closer, his eyes pleading, Ava Mae let out a whimper and tried to climb further up the bench. Her yellow dress caught on the edge, a button popping loose and rolling across the floor. Judge Lawson raised his hand, signaling for silence. This court is in immediate recess." He nodded to the bailiff, who began ushering people toward the exit. "Clear the room, please." The authority in his voice brooked no argument. With gentle movements that belied his imposing presence, Judge Lawson reached down and lifted Ava Mae into his arms. Her tiny body curled against him, her sobs muffled against his shoulder as he stood. The child's fingers twisted into the fabric of his robe, holding on with desperate strength. Daniel Garrett remained rooted to the spot, his broad shoulders slumped in defeat. The man who had rushed into burning buildings without hesitation now looked utterly lost, watching helplessly as Judge Lawson carried his foster daughter toward the chamber doors. His tie hung loose and forgotten around his neck. The heavy wooden doors closed behind them with a resounding thud, leaving Garrett alone in the emptying courtroom, surrounded by the wreckage of his dreams. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the windows, now illuminating nothing but scattered papers and empty chairs. The heavy oak door of Judge Lawson's chambers closed with a soft click, shutting out the chaos from the courtroom. Inside, the room felt like a different world. Warm lighting from brass desk lamps cast a gentle glow over dark wooden bookshelves and leather-bound law books. The familiar scent of old paper and leather hung in the air, usually a comfort to the judge. But today, even this peaceful atmosphere couldn't ease the thick tension that filled the room. Ava Mae sat hunched on the edge of the leather couch, her yellow dress wrinkled from her emotional outburst. Her small fingers remained twisted in Judge Lawson's black robe as if it were a lifeline, knuckles white from the intensity of her grip. Tears made wet tracks down her cheeks, and her chest hitched with quiet hiccups that shook her tiny frame. Judge Lawson knelt before her, his knees cracking slightly as he lowered himself to her level. His usually stern face had softened, showing the gentleness that lay beneath his professional exterior. The lines around his eyes creased with concern. "Here you go, sweetheart," he said, pulling a tissue from the box on his desk and offering it to her. She took it with trembling fingers but didn't let go of his robe, as if afraid he might disappear if she released her hold. "Can you tell me why you don't want to go with Mr. Garrett?" he asked, keeping his voice low and soothing, the way he spoke to his own grandchildren when they were upset. "You're safe here. You can tell me anything. Nothing bad will happen to you." Ava Mae's lower lip quivered. She looked down at her patent leather shoes, scuffing them against the carpet. Her breath came in short, nervous bursts. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile as spun glass. "Mama said not to trust him." Judge Lawson felt his stomach drop, a cold weight settling in his chest. He knew Maria Carter, Ava Mae's biological mother, had died in a house fire 2 years ago. His mind raced with questions, but he kept his expression calm for Ava Mae's sake, years of courtroom experience helping him maintain his composure. He pressed the intercom button on his desk, the small click seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Send Mr. Garrett in, please." When Daniel Garrett entered the chamber, he looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His usually neat shirt was rumpled, his face pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes, speaking of emotional exhaustion. His eyes immediately found Ava Mae, and the pain in them was almost physical, like a visible wound. "Judge, please." Garrett's voice cracked. He ran a hand through his graying hair, leaving it standing in disheveled spikes. "I don't understand. She's my little girl. I've raised her for 2 years. We read stories every night. I make her pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse every Sunday. She always asks for extra blueberries." His voice trailed off, thick with emotion. At the sound of his voice, Ava Mae scrambled behind Judge Lawson, pressing her face into the back of his robe. Her small body trembled like a leaf in the wind, and he could feel her rapid heartbeat through the thick fabric. Judge Lawson held up a hand, stopping Garrett from coming closer. "Mr. Garrett, I need you to stay where you are." He glanced at Ava Mae's obvious terror, then back at the devastated man before him. Something wasn't adding up. The pieces of this puzzle didn't fit together properly. "I'm ordering an immediate hold on these adoption proceedings," he declared, his voice firm but not unkind. "My assistant will contact Child Welfare Services for a complete review of Ava Mae's case file. We need to understand what's happening here." "But Judge..." Garrett started to protest, taking a step forward before catching himself. This isn't a punishment, Mr. Garrett, but when a child shows this level of fear, I have no choice but to investigate. Judge Lawson pressed the intercom again. Linda, please contact Emergency Foster Services. We need immediate temporary placement. Within minutes, a foster care worker arrived. A kind-faced woman with silver-streaked hair who introduced herself as Mrs. Thompson. She brought a stuffed rabbit for Ava May, soft and floppy-eared, which the child accepted hesitantly, her fingers brushing over its velvet nose. As Mrs. Thompson prepared to take Ava May to her temporary home, Judge Lawson watched Garrett. The man stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, looking like someone had ripped his heart out. His eyes never left Ava May as Mrs. Thompson led her toward the door, tracking her every movement with desperate intensity. Just before they left, Ava May turned back once, clutching her new stuffed rabbit to her chest like armor. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Was it confusion, sadness, recognition? But then fear won out, and she quickly turned away, disappearing through the doorway with Mrs. Thompson, leaving only the echo of small footsteps behind. Garrett remained motionless, a statue of grief in the middle of the judge's chambers, his shoulders slumped in defeat as if the weight of the world had settled upon them. Judge Lawson drummed his fingers on his mahogany desk, phone pressed to his ear. The afternoon sun slanted through his office window, casting long shadows across stacks of case files and highlighting dust motes dancing in the air. Ms. Reynolds, I need those records immediately, all of them, even the sealed ones. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Judge Lawson, some of these files are quite old, the social worker replied hesitantly. They're in our archive system, possibly even in storage at another facility. Then get someone to pull them, he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came with years on the bench. This is about Ava May Carter's welfare. I need to understand what happened before she entered the system. Ms. Reynolds sighed. Yes, Your Honor, I'll have them sent over within the hour. True to her word, a thick manila envelope arrived at his chambers. Judge Lawson spread the documents across his desk, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he began piecing together Ava May's past. The familiar scent of old paper and ink filled his nostrils as he worked. The first document made him pause. A death certificate for Maria Carter. Cause of death, smoke inhalation from a house fire, dated 3 years ago. His stomach clenched at the stark details. He dug deeper, searching for any connection to Daniel Garrett. Background checks, home studies, character references. Everything came back clean. Garrett's record was spotless, his reputation as a foster parent exemplary. This doesn't make sense, Lawson muttered, rubbing his temples as a headache began to form. If Garrett had never met Maria Carter, how could she have warned Ava May about him? And why? Across town, at a modest ranch house with cheerful yellow curtains and flower boxes bursting with petunias, Daniel Garrett stood on the front porch. His shoulders slumped as the temporary foster mother, Mrs. Chen, delivered the news, her kind face etched with concern. I'm sorry, Mr. Garrett, she said softly, wringing her hands. When I told her you were here, she ran to her room and wouldn't come out. She's terrified. She even pushed her toy chest against the door. Garrett's face crumpled. Could you tell her I love her? That I miss her? His voice trembled with emotion. Mrs. Chen nodded sympathetically. Through the window, they could see a small shadow dart away. Ava May, hiding from even a glimpse of her foster father. The curtain swayed slightly in her wake. I don't understand, Garrett's voice cracked. 2 years we've been together. She called me Daddy last week at breakfast. She's never been afraid of me before. We were making pancakes and she was laughing. Back in his office, Judge Lawson frowned at a peculiar detail in Ava May's placement records. Something felt off about the initial foster care assignment. Dates that didn't quite align, signatures that seemed rushed. He picked up his phone again. Ms. Reynolds, I need you to check something else. Who handled Ava May's original placement after the fire? At the Chen house, Garrett stood on the porch steps, his hand resting on the railing. A child's bicycle lay on its side in the front yard. Not Ava May's, but it reminded him of the pink one waiting at home, the one he'd bought for her upcoming birthday. Its training wheels still wrapped in plastic, waiting for the moment he'd teach her to ride. His vision blurred as tears welled up, and he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. Mrs. Chen touched his arm gently. "Give her time, Mr. Garrett. Children process trauma in their own way. Sometimes they need space to sort through their feelings." He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. As he walked to his truck, each step felt heavier than the last. The tears he'd been holding back finally spilled over as he reached for the door handle, his little girl's terrified face haunting his thoughts. The memory of her morning hugs and bedtime stories felt like a knife twisting in his heart. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds in Judge Lawson's office, casting striped shadows across his desk. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten, as he pored over the thick manila folder before him. The label Carter Maria Fire Incident Report seemed to stare back at him accusingly, a silent reminder of the weight of his responsibility. His assistant knocked softly before entering, her footsteps barely audible on the carpeted floor. "Your Honor, the background check on Mr. Garrett just came in." Lawson nodded, taking the new papers with weathered hands. Everything looked pristine, not even a parking ticket. Daniel Garrett was, by all accounts, a model citizen. 20 years as a firefighter, numerous commendations, active in community service. The kind of record that usually made adoption proceedings straightforward. Then something caught his eye, making him lean forward in his chair. His heart skipped a beat as he read the entry from 3 years ago. Responded to residential fire, 1247 Maple Street. The same fire that had claimed Maria Carter's life. His fingers traced the words as if touching them might reveal hidden truths. "Get me Detective Morris on the phone," he ordered his assistant, his voice tight with urgency. While waiting for the call, he shuffled through more papers until he found what he was looking for: Ava Mae's initial placement report. The pages were worn at the edges from frequent handling. The phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet office. "Detective Morris? Judge Lawson here. I need everything you have on the Carter House fire from 3 years ago." "That's a cold case, Your Honor," Morris replied, his voice crackling through the line. "But I'll pull what we have." A soft knock interrupted him. Sarah, the new foster mother, stood in his doorway looking worried, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her cardigan. "Your Honor?" Ava Mae had another nightmare last night. She kept crying for her mama. Lawson's expression softened, the lines around his eyes deepening with concern. "What exactly did she say?" Sarah wrung her hands, her distress evident. "She just kept repeating, 'Mama said not to trust him,' over and over. She was terrified, wouldn't go back to sleep for hours. We had to leave the nightlight on until morning." Lawson thanked her and turned back to his desk, spreading out the documents like pieces of a complex puzzle. Something wasn't adding up. Daniel Garrett had been one of the first responders that night, yet he claimed no memory of Ava Mae. How could a man forget a child he'd later come to foster? The contradiction nagged at him like a splinter under his skin. He picked up his phone again, his jaw set with determination. "This is Judge Lawson. I need the complete fire department report from the Carter House fire, including all responding personnel and their statements." Hours passed as he dug deeper into the case, the clock on his wall ticking away the minutes. The fire report lay open before him, its details painting a picture that made less sense the more he studied it. If Garrett was telling the truth about not remembering Ava Mae, why had Maria Carter warned her daughter about him? And if he was lying, what was he hiding? The questions multiplied like shadows at sunset. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across his office when his assistant brought in another stack of files, their edges crisp and official. "The fire department records you requested, Your Honor." Lawson reached for them with trembling hands, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. Something in these pages would explain everything: why a dying mother would warn her daughter, why a decorated firefighter wouldn't remember a child he later fostered, and most importantly, what had really happened that terrible night. He opened the first page of the fire report, his eyes scanning the detailed account. As he read, his face grew increasingly grave, the color draining from his features. The truth was there in black and white, and it would change everything about this case. His fingers gripped the edge of his desk as the pieces finally began to fall into place. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the dusty police archives as Judge Lawson stood at the counter, drumming his fingers against the worn surface. Officer Jenkins, a gray-haired clerk with thick glasses, shuffled through a row of filing cabinets, muttering softly to himself as he searched. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten cases filled the air. "Here it is, Your Honor." Jenkins pulled out a hefty folder, its edges frayed and yellowed with age and frequent handling. "Carter Residence Fire, Fatal Incident," was typed across the label in faded letters. "Strange case, this one. Never officially closed, been bothering me for years, if I'm honest." Lawson's brow furrowed as he accepted the folder, feeling its substantial weight. Finding an empty desk nearby, he began sorting through the documents with methodical precision. Incident reports, witness statements, and forensic analyses spilled across the surface, each page telling a piece of the tragic story. Then one name jumped out at him like a neon sign: Daniel Garrett. His hands trembled slightly as he read the report, the words swimming before his tired eyes. Garrett had been first on scene that night, part of Engine Company 47. According to his statement, he'd heard crying coming from the nursery while other firefighters battled the intense flames below. Breaking through the window, he'd found a baby girl, Ava May, in her crib, somehow untouched by the thick smoke filling the room. "This can't be right," Lawson muttered, rubbing his temples as exhaustion crept in. If Garrett had saved Ava May that night, why didn't he recognize her when she came into his care 2 years later? The judge flipped through more pages, searching for answers, his legal instincts telling him something wasn't adding up. The coroner's report on Maria Carter made his blood run cold. She'd been found in the master bedroom, dead from smoke inhalation, her body curled up near the door as if she'd been trying to escape. But there was more. The bedroom door had been locked from the outside, trapping her inside as the flames approached. "Jenkins," Lawson called out, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Was there ever any suspicion of foul play?" The clerk adjusted his glasses, leaning against a nearby filing cabinet. The investigator thought it was odd about the locked door, but nothing concrete ever came of it. Case kind of fell through the cracks after that. Too many questions, not enough answers. Lawson returned to the documents, his legal mind clicking pieces into place like a complex puzzle. A locked door, a mother's warning to her daughter, a firefighter who somehow didn't remember the child he'd saved. Each detail seemed more suspicious than the last. "I need copies of everything," he told Jenkins, his voice firm with determination. "And get me Detective Rodriguez from Arson Investigation. This case needs a fresh set of eyes. Something's not right here." As Jenkins worked the copy machine, its mechanical whirring filling the silence, Lawson studied the crime scene photos with growing concern. The charred remains of the master bedroom door showed clear signs of tampering with the lock, scratch marks around the keyhole, damage to the mechanism itself. Maria Carter hadn't simply been trapped by the fire. Someone had wanted her in that room. His thoughts turned to Ava May, to her visceral fear of Garrett that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. Mama said not to trust him. The words echoed in his mind as he stared at the report, sending a chill down his spine. What had Maria Carter known? What had she seen that made her warn her daughter about the man who would later become her foster father? Lawson gathered the copied files, his mind already formulating next steps. A forensic reinvestigation might uncover what was missed 3 years ago. Technology had advanced, and fresh eyes might see what others had overlooked in the chaos and confusion of that tragic night. "Thanks, Jenkins," he said, tucking the files under his arm. The weight of them felt heavy, like the burden of truth they might contain. As he closed the original folder, his pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the ambient sounds of the archive room. This wasn't just an adoption case anymore. It was something far more complicated, and potentially far more sinister than he'd initially imagined. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds in Judge Lawson's chambers when Daniel Garrett burst through the door. His face was flushed red, his normally neat shirt wrinkled and untucked, his firefighter's badge glinting dully on his belt. Sweat beaded on his forehead from the summer heat and his frantic rush to the courthouse. "You think I did something to her?" Garrett's voice cracked with emotion. His hands shook as he gripped the back of a leather chair, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. I raised her. I love her more than anything in this world. She's my little girl. Judge Lawson remained seated, his expression carefully neutral, though concern flickered in his dark eyes. He folded his hands on the polished desk and met Garrett's wild eyes. She's terrified of you, Mr. Garrett. And that means something. As a judge, I cannot ignore a child's fear, especially not when it runs this deep. This is insane. Garrett slammed his palms onto the desk, causing a coffee mug to rattle and spill drops onto scattered papers. You're tearing my family apart based on a 3-year-old's fear? She's confused, traumatized. She needs help, not separation. Can't you see what this is doing to her? Without a word, Lawson reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the fire report, its edges worn and yellowed with age. He placed it carefully on the desk, sliding it toward Garrett. The moment Garrett saw his own name on the incident report, all the color drained from his face, leaving him ashen and shaken. You saved her, Lawson said quietly, watching Garrett's reaction with keen interest. So why doesn't she remember that? And more importantly, why don't you? What happened that night, Mr. Garrett? Garrett's hands trembled as he picked up the report, the paper crinkling loudly in the silent room. His eyes darted across the page, growing wider with each line, horror dawning in their depths. I don't... He sank into the chair, the paper crinkling in his grip. This was my rescue? She was the baby I pulled out? Dear God. Yes, Lawson confirmed, his voice gentle but firm. You were first on scene. You broke through the nursery window and saved her life. The report states you carried her out yourself. Garrett's anger suddenly deflated, replaced by a crushing weight of realization. He ran a shaking hand through his graying hair, his shoulders slumping beneath an invisible burden. All this time, I never made the connection. There are so many rescues, so many fires. His voice broke. But her mother, she told Ava Mae not to trust me. Why would she say that? What else happened that night? The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with unspoken questions and painful possibilities. Finally, Garrett stood up, his movements slow and defeated, like a man twice his age. If she'll never trust me, then I won't force her. His voice was thick with unshed tears. I'm withdrawing my adoption request. She deserves to feel safe. He pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket, the adoption papers he'd been carrying since that morning, his hope literally folded and worn, and placed them on the judge's desk. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, each step seeming to cost him dearly. Outside in the hallway, little Ava Mae sat on a wooden bench, her legs swinging back and forth, a social worker beside her. Her flower print dress was wrinkled from sitting, her dark curls falling around her face. She looked up as Garrett passed, and for a moment their eyes met, his filled with pain, hers with a mixture of fear and something deeper, more confused. Garrett's steps faltered, but he kept walking, his shoulders hunched against the weight of loss. That night in her temporary foster home, Ava Mae curled up in her new bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit, the only familiar thing in this strange place. Her small body shook with sobs as she cried herself to sleep, whimpering words that sounded like daddy between her tears. The moonlight through her window cast shadows that danced like flames on her wall, and she pulled the covers tighter around herself, trying to hide from memories she couldn't fully understand. The grandfather clock in Judge Lawson's study struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the quiet house. He sat at his mahogany desk, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, staring at the fire report spread before him. The lamp cast a warm glow over the papers, but the words seemed to grow colder with each reading. Outside, a gentle rain had started to fall, tapping against the window panes like nature's own timekeeping. Cause of death, smoke inhalation found in a locked room. The phrase jumped out at him for the 100th time. His coffee had long gone cold, forgotten beside a stack of legal papers that threatened to topple over the edge of his desk. Why would she be locked in? He muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. The question had been gnawing at him all evening, like a splinter he couldn't quite reach. If Daniel Garrett was the hero who saved Ava Mae, why would Maria Carter warn her daughter not to trust him? Something wasn't adding up, and the math was keeping him awake. The judge pulled out his reading glasses and studied the crime scene photos again, spreading them across his desk like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. The master bedroom door showed clear signs of being locked from the outside, not the inside. His stomach tightened at the implication, and he felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the fire department's after-hours number. Despite the late hour, this couldn't wait. Lives hung in the balance of what he might discover. "Hello, this is Judge Ethan Lawson," he spoke quietly into the phone, his voice carrying the gravity of his position. "I need the first responders' transcripts from the Carter House fire, 3 years ago. Yes, I understand it's late, but this is regarding an ongoing case." The secretary on the other end sounded tired but professional. "I'll need to pull those from archives, Your Honor. They should be available first thing in the morning." "Thank you. I'm particularly interested in any record of Maria Carter's last words, anything she might have said to the first responders." His pen tapped nervously against the desk as he spoke. He made a note in his legal pad. Maria Carter, locked room, last words. The yellow paper was covered in similar scribbled observations, questions, and theories, each one a potential thread in this complicated tapestry. Lawson stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the quiet street below. The streetlights cast long shadows through the rain-streaked glass. Somewhere across town, little Ava Mae was probably having another nightmare, crying out for a mother who could no longer comfort her. And Daniel Garrett was likely lying awake too, tormented by the loss of the child he'd raised, wondering if he'd ever see her smile at him again. The judge returned to his desk and picked up another photo from the file. It showed the charred remains of the master bedroom, a scene of devastation that made his heart ache. The window was intact. Maria could have escaped if the door hadn't been locked. Someone had wanted her to stay inside. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the late hour. His eyes felt heavy as he gathered the scattered papers back into the manila folder. The weight of unsolved questions pressed down on him like a physical burden. Tomorrow, he would have Maria's final words. Maybe then he'd understand why a dying mother would warn her daughter about the man who saved her life. He closed the file with a soft thud, knowing that somewhere in Maria Carter's last moments lay the truth that could unravel this entire mystery. The rain continued its gentle rhythm outside, a reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried forever. Judge Lawson's fingers trembled slightly as he held the newly arrived transcript. The morning sun streamed through his office windows, casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. But a chill ran through him as he read Maria Carter's final words. "Don't let him take her." 4 simple words that changed everything. 4 words that made his stomach twist with dread. He laid the paper down carefully, as if it might crumble under his touch, smoothing it with weathered hands. His mind raced back to Ava Mae's terrified face in the courtroom, her small body shaking as she clung to his robes, fingers twisted desperately in the black fabric. All this time, they'd assumed her fear was directed at Garrett. How wrong they might have been. "We've been looking at this all wrong," he muttered, reaching for his phone with renewed urgency. He punched in the number for Child Welfare Services, his heart pounding with each digit. "This is Judge Lawson. I need the complete placement records for Ava Mae Carter, including all personnel involved in her case." He drummed his fingers on his desk while listening, leaving small marks on the polished wood. "Yes, I understand it's archived. No, it can't wait until tomorrow. This is a matter of urgent importance." The judge pulled out a legal pad and began making notes, his normally precise handwriting growing messier with each line. If Maria's warning wasn't about Garrett, then who was she trying to protect her daughter from? Someone involved in Ava Mae's placement after the fire? Someone who had access to her? The possibilities made his blood run cold. His assistant knocked and entered with a fresh cup of coffee, the aroma filling his office. "Judge, I've got the Social Services office on line 2. They say they found the original files." Lawson grabbed the phone, nearly knocking over his pen holder. This is Judge Lawson. Yes, I need everything. Intake forms, placement records, personnel assignments. Who handled her case initially? He scribbled rapidly as the person on the other end spoke, filling page after page with potential leads. The coffee sat untouched as he worked, steam rising and dissipating in the morning light, pouring over every detail. Maria's words echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. Don't let him take her. Not don't trust him, as Ava May had said. The actual warning was different, more specific, more urgent, more frightening in its implications. He spread the transcript on his desk next to his notes, comparing them side by side. Something wasn't adding up. Ava May's memory of her mother's warning had shifted slightly, but the core message remained the same. There was someone to fear, someone to avoid, someone who might still be out there. Lawson reached for his phone again, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. The mystery of who him referred to lay somewhere in those placement records, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and time. As he dialed, his jaw set with determination. Maria Carter's last words weren't just a dying mother's fear. They were a warning, clear and desperate, and he intended to find out exactly who she was warning against. The clock ticked steadily as he waited for the call to connect, each second feeling like an eternity. Whatever truth lay buried in those files, he would find it. He owed it to both Maria and Ava May to uncover what really happened that night and who him really was. The weight of this responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, but he welcomed it. Sometimes the hardest truths were the ones most worth finding. Judge Lawson's hands shook as he spread the documents across his mahogany desk. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through his office windows, but he barely noticed the passing time. Those haunting words, "Don't let him take her," echoed in his mind like a warning bell, making his stomach twist with growing unease. He reached for his phone, dialing the police records department with trembling fingers. "This is Judge Ethan Lawson. I need an official transcript of Maria Carter's final statements from the night of the fire." "Yes, I'll hold." He drummed his fingers nervously on the desk while classical music played softly in his ear. While waiting, his assistant Claire Matthews knocked softly before entering. Her face was pinched with concern as she carried a thick manila folder, its edges worn and slightly torn. "Judge, this just came from Child Welfare Services. The courier said it was urgent." "Thank you, Claire." He gestured for her to set it down, then immediately began flipping through the pages, his heart racing faster with each turn. Something wasn't right. The placement records were incomplete, glaringly so. Where standard protocol required detailed documentation of every step in a child's placement, Ava May's file had obvious gaps, like pieces missing from a crucial puzzle. "This can't be right," he muttered, scanning the pages more carefully, his reading glasses slipping down his nose. There's no record of who handled her initial placement, no social worker's name, no placement assessment. His voice trailed off as he reached the bottom of the form, his finger stopping at a familiar signature. There, in neat black ink, was a single signature: Jacob Crowley. Lawson's blood ran cold, and a shiver ran down his spine. He'd seen that name before, in a case that still haunted his sleepless nights. 2 years ago, Crowley had been investigated for foster care fraud, placing children with unqualified families for kickbacks. The case had fallen apart due to missing evidence, but Lawson had never forgotten the cold look in Crowley's eyes during the hearing, like a shark sizing up its prey. "Claire," he called out, his voice tight with urgency, "pull everything we have on Jacob Crowley's previous cases. Every single document, no matter how small." She nodded, hurrying from the room as Lawson continued examining the documents, his reading lamp casting a harsh glare on the papers. The placement papers were dated just days after the fire that killed Maria Carter. The timing was suspicious, too rushed, too neat, like someone trying to cover their tracks. His phone buzzed, startling him from his concentration. The police department had found the transcript. As they read it to him, Lawson's suspicions crystallized into a terrifying picture. Maria Carter's final words weren't just a mother's desperate plea. They were a specific warning about someone she feared. He looked again at Ava May's placement papers, seeing them with new eyes. The missing information, Crowley's signature, the rushed timeline, it all pointed to something darker than a simple adoption gone wrong. His heart ached for the little girl who'd been through so much. Lawson leaned back in his chair, the weight of understanding settling heavily on his shoulders. The leather creaked beneath him as he processed the horrible truth. All this time, they'd misinterpreted Ava Mae's fear. It wasn't Daniel Garrett who had frightened her. It was whoever had originally taken her from her dying mother's care. And now, he had a sickening feeling he knew exactly who that someone was. The evening shadows lengthened across Judge Lawson's dining room as he sat hunched over his laptop, the blue screen light illuminating his tired face. Empty coffee cups littered the table alongside scattered papers from Ava Mae's file. His finger traced over Jacob Crowley's signature again and again, as if the physical contact might reveal its secrets. The ink seemed to mock him with its perfect loops and swirls. "Something's not adding up," he muttered, typing Crowley's name into the Child Welfare Services employee database. The results made him sit up straighter. Crowley had resigned abruptly, just 3 days after signing off on Ava Mae's placement with Daniel Garrett. No notice, no explanation. He'd simply vanished. The timing sent a chill down Lawson's spine. Lawson's hands moved quickly over the keyboard, pulling up old case files. His eyes widened as he read through investigation after investigation. Crowley's name appeared in multiple fraud allegations, all involving suspicious foster care placements. The pattern was clear: children placed in homes without proper documentation, money changing hands under the table. Each new file added another piece to the disturbing puzzle. "My God," Lawson whispered, running a hand through his gray hair. The allegations were serious. Dozens of children potentially trafficked through the foster system for profit. But before authorities could build their case, Crowley had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and unanswered questions. Lawson glanced at Maria Carter's photo in the file. Her dark eyes seemed to stare back at him, full of desperate warning. The photograph was creased at the corners, worn from handling. "You knew something, didn't you?" he said softly. "You knew what he was doing." His heart ached for the mother who'd died trying to protect her child. With trembling fingers, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Detective Mitchell." "Ryan, it's Judge Lawson. I need information about Jacob Crowley." His voice was steady, despite the anxiety churning in his gut. There was a pause on the line. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while." Mitchell's tone carried a weight of unfinished business. "What can you tell me about his case?" Mitchell sighed heavily. "It was bad, Ethan. We had evidence he was selling kids through the system, placing them with families who paid him under the table. By the time we got enough for an arrest warrant, he'd cleaned out his accounts and disappeared." The detective's disgust was evident in every word. Lawson's stomach churned. Was there any indication he was involved in Maria Carter's death? Carter? Mitchell paused. "The woman who died in that house fire? We never made a direct connection, but the timing. Crowley vanished right after that fire." The implication hung heavy in the silence between them. Lawson pressed his fingers against his temple, fighting off a headache. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture more disturbing than he'd imagined. Each revelation felt like another weight on his conscience. "Thanks, Ryan. Send me everything you have on Crowley's case." He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. The dining room felt suddenly too quiet, too dark. What had started as a simple adoption hearing had unveiled something far more sinister. The shadows in the corners seemed to hold secrets of their own. The phone's screen still glowed with Crowley's employee photo, a thin-faced man with cold eyes and a practiced smile. Lawson stared at it, wondering how many other children's lives this man had destroyed for profit. The face looking back at him wasn't just that of a corrupt official. It was the face of a predator who had turned the foster system into his personal hunting ground. Judge Lawson drummed his fingers on his desk, staring at his phone. He'd been up most of the night connecting dots, and now he needed answers. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. but determination kept him focused as he dialed Child Welfare Services. Child Welfare Services, this is Sarah Denton speaking. A young voice answered, bright and professional. This is Judge Ethan Lawson. I need all available records on a former employee named Jacob Crowley. His voice was firm but polite, masking the urgency he felt coursing through him. There was a long pause on the other end, filled with uncomfortable static. I'm not sure I can... Sarah's voice trailed off uncertainly, clearly caught between protocol and authority. Is there a problem? Lawson asked, leaning forward in his chair, his free hand gripping the armrest. Sir, those records, I don't think I can release them without a court order. Sarah's voice wavered slightly, anxiety evident in every word. Lawson softened his tone, knowing he'd catch more flies with honey. Miss Denton, I understand your hesitation, but there's a 3-year-old girl whose safety might be at risk. I need to know everything about Crowley's time there. He could picture Ava Mae's frightened face as he spoke. He heard Sarah take a deep breath, papers rustling in the background. Judge Lawson, Okay. Give me an hour to pull his employment records. True to her word, 60 minutes later, Claire Matthews walked into his office carrying a thick manila folder, its edges worn and stuffed with papers. This just arrived from Child Welfare, she said, placing it on his desk with a soft thud. Lawson opened the file with careful hands, the musty smell of old paper filling his nostrils. Pages of case assignments, performance reviews, and placement records spread across his desk like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. His eyes scanned each document methodically until something caught his attention, making him sit up straighter. Wait a minute, he muttered, pulling out 2 sheets of paper with trembling fingers. The first showed Crowley's case assignments. Ava Mae Carter was the very last child he'd placed before his sudden resignation, but it was the second document that made his blood run cold, sending a chill down his spine. There, in black and white, was proof that Crowley had been Maria Carter's caseworker in the months leading up to her death. He'd been involved with both mother and daughter, his signature scrawled across both files like a spider's web connecting them. Lawson's hands trembled slightly as he laid the papers side by side, his mouth going dry. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Crowley had worked with Maria Carter, then placed Ava Mae after her death, and immediately disappeared, leaving a trail of suspicion in his wake. Claire, he called out, his voice hoarse with tension. His assistant appeared in the doorway, notepad ready. Get me everything we have on Maria Carter's death. Every single document. Leave nothing out. His heart pounded against his ribs as the pieces started falling into place like a horrifying jigsaw puzzle. Maria's warning wasn't about Daniel Garrett at all. It couldn't have been. She'd been trying to protect her daughter from someone else, someone who had direct access to both of them through Child Welfare Services, someone who might still pose a threat to this day. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the court records office as Judge Lawson settled into a worn leather chair across from David Renshaw. The investigative journalist's salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes spoke of decades chasing down leads and uncovering truths. His weathered notebook, filled with cramped handwriting, lay open on the scratched wooden table between them. Thanks for meeting me, David, Lawson said, spreading out the files on the table between them. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the documents. I need your expertise on something. Renshaw adjusted his reading glasses, examining the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime piecing together hidden stories. Jacob Crowley? Now that's a name I haven't heard in a while. His finger traced the name on the yellowed paper. What can you tell me about him? Lawson leaned forward, watching Renshaw's expression carefully, noting every subtle change that crossed the journalist's face. Crowley was a piece of work, Renshaw said, shaking his head, his jaw tightening with old anger. We suspected him of illegal child placements for years, but could never prove it. The man was careful, always covered his tracks, like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. Lawson pulled out the transcript of Maria Carter's final words, the paper slightly crumpled from being handled so many times. What about this? Don't let him take her. Maria Carter said this right before she died in that house fire. Renshaw's face darkened as he read the transcript. His fingers tightened on the paper, creating small creases in the corners. If she knew something about Crowley's operations. He let the thought hang in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Exactly, Lawson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe she wasn't just an accident victim. They spent the next hour combing through old news clippings and case files, the rustle of paper filling the quiet room. The smell of old documents and leather bindings surrounded them as Renshaw's experienced eyes caught something in a faded newspaper article. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a small paragraph, his finger trembling slightly. Maria Carter filed a formal complaint against Child Welfare Services 1 month before her death. Lawson's pulse quickened and he wiped his suddenly damp palms on his slacks. What happened to the complaint? That's just it, Renshaw said, rifling through more papers, his movements growing more agitated. It vanished. Never investigated, never followed up, like it never existed. And guess who was assigned as her caseworker? Crowley, Lawson said grimly, his stomach turning. The same man who later placed her daughter in foster care after her death. Renshaw's voice was heavy with implications. The late afternoon light caught the dust motes swirling around them, like silent witnesses to their discovery. They spread more documents across the table, connecting dates and events. The timeline was damning. Maria's complaint, her death, Crowley's handling of Ava May's placement, and his sudden resignation. Each piece fit together like a terrible puzzle. Lawson and Renshaw exchanged tense looks. The evidence painted a disturbing picture. Maria Carter's death wasn't the accident everyone believed it to be. The weight of this revelation settled over them like a heavy blanket, making the spacious office feel suddenly claustrophobic. This goes deeper than foster care fraud, Renshaw said quietly, gathering the papers into neat piles with trembling hands. Maria Carter knew something, and she paid for it with her life. The question is, how many others knew too? The evening shadows lengthened across Judge Lawson's study as he poured amber whiskey into a crystal glass. His hands trembled slightly, making the liquid ripple and dance in the fading light. The weight of what he discovered today pressed heavily on his shoulders, making each breath feel like a burden. Sitting at his mahogany desk, Lawson opened his laptop and accessed the criminal database. The blue light illuminated his tired face and the deep worry lines around his eyes as he typed Jacob Crowley into the search bar. His throat tightened as he read through the file that appeared, each new detail worse than the last. Multiple allegations of foster care fraud, he muttered, taking a long sip of whiskey that did little to calm his nerves. Suspected of falsifying placement records. The more he read, the worse it got, his heart sinking with each damning piece of evidence. He reached for his phone with shaking fingers and dialed Detective Ryan Mitchell's number. The detective answered on the third ring, his voice gruff with fatigue and something that sounded like resignation. "Mitchell here. Ryan, it's Judge Lawson. I need to know everything you have on Jacob Crowley." He tried to keep his voice steady, professional, but urgency crept in despite his best efforts. There was a heavy pause before Mitchell spoke, the silence thick with unspoken horrors. "That's a dark case, Judge. Crowley disappeared right when we were closing in. We had solid evidence he was running an illegal adoption ring, taking kids from vulnerable families, falsifying documents, selling them to the highest bidder. The things we found." He trailed off, leaving the worst unsaid. Lawson's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles turned white. And Maria Carter, she knew something, didn't she? "Yeah." Mitchell's voice grew quiet, almost reverent. "She filed a report against him about a month before she died, said he was threatening her, trying to pressure her into giving up her daughter. We were investigating, but then she died in that fire," Lawson finished, his stomach churning with a mixture of rage and despair. "A fire in a locked room," Mitchell added grimly, his words heavy with implications. "We could never prove it, but the timing was suspicious as hell. Crowley vanished right after like smoke in the wind." Lawson stared at the amber liquid in his glass, seeing the pieces fall into place with horrifying clarity. She wasn't just warning her daughter about strangers, was she? She knew Crowley would come for Ava May if anything happened to her. "That's our theory," Mitchell confirmed, exhaustion evident in his voice. "But without proof." And now Ava Mae's placement papers have Crowley's signature on them, Lawson said, his voice tight with anger and growing dread. What? Mitchell's tone sharpened like a blade. Judge, if Crowley was involved in that girl's placement— I know, Lawson set his whiskey down hard enough to make the glass rattle against the desk, the sound echoing in the quiet room. The terrible truth settled over him like a heavy shroud. Ava Mae hadn't just been misplaced in the system. She had been deliberately taken, part of Crowley's illegal operation, a pawn in his twisted game. His jaw clenched as he looked at Maria Carter's file photo on his screen. She smiled back at him, young and determined, a mother who had tried to protect her daughter, who had paid the ultimate price for standing up to Crowley. And now her daughter, that precious 3-year-old who had clung to his robes in terror, was caught in the middle of something far more sinister than anyone had realized. The thought made his blood run cold. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Judge Lawson strode through the court archives, his footsteps echoing off the worn tile floor. Claire Matthews hurried behind him, her heels clicking rhythmically. The musty smell of old papers and decades of forgotten stories filled the air, making his nose twitch. "Morning, Your Honor," the archivist, Mrs. Peterson, greeted them from behind her desk. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and reading glasses perched on her nose. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she'd already been at work for hours. "I need everything you have on Maria Carter," Lawson said, his voice firm but tired. The weight of sleepless nights showed in the slump of his shoulders. Every document she filed in the months before her death. Mrs. Peterson's fingers hesitated over her keyboard, her brow furrowing. "That's quite old, Your Honor. Some of those files might be in deep storage. We'll have to search through the basement archives." "Whatever it takes," he insisted, leaning forward on her desk. "This is urgent. A little girl's future depends on what we find." 20 minutes later, they sat at a long table covered with dusty boxes and manila folders, the morning light streaming through narrow windows. Claire organized the documents by date, while Lawson methodically reviewed each page, his reading glasses slipping down his nose as he scrutinized every detail. "Wait," he said suddenly, pulling a wrinkled envelope from between two court motions. The paper was yellowed with age, and the corner was slightly singed, as if it had tried to tell its own story of survival. Inside was a handwritten letter, never properly filed, the ink slightly faded but still legible. His hands shook slightly as he read, "Dear Honorable Judge, I fear for my daughter's safety. Someone in the system is targeting vulnerable families. My caseworker, Mr. Crowley, has made threats. He says if I don't cooperate, he'll make sure I never see Ava Mae again. Please help us. I have evidence of what he's doing, but I'm afraid to come forward. If anything happens to me, please protect my baby girl. Maria Carter." The letter was dated 3 days before the fire that had changed everything. Claire. Lawson's voice was hoarse, his throat tight with emotion. This letter was never processed. No judge ever saw it. She tried to save her daughter, and nobody knew. Claire leaned over to look, her perfume mixing with the dusty air. "There's no file stamp, no court seal. Someone intercepted it. They silenced her before she could expose the truth." Lawson spread the letter carefully on the table, treating it like the precious evidence it was. Maria's desperate words stared back at him, a mother's final plea for help that never reached its destination. The system she'd trusted to protect her daughter had failed her completely, leaving behind only these scorched edges as testament to her struggle. "Mrs. Peterson?" he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet archive. "Who was handling incoming court documents when this was submitted?" The archivist consulted her records, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Let me check. That would have been under Jacob Crowley's department. He supervised all incoming legal documents back then." Lawson's jaw tightened, and a muscle twitched in his cheek. The same man Maria had tried to report had been in position to bury her cry for help. He looked at the letter again, at the slight scorch marks on its edges, physical evidence that had survived the very fire that claimed Maria's life, as if determined to finally tell its story. "Make copies," he told Claire, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "Then get this to forensics. I want fingerprint analysis, dating verification, Everything they can tell us about this document. We're going to make this right." Claire carefully placed the letter in a protective sleeve while Lawson stared at the boxes of files, his mind racing. Maria Carter hadn't just been afraid. She'd tried to save her daughter through proper channels. But someone had made sure her warning never saw the light of day. Until now. The truth had waited patiently in these dusty archives. And finally, justice had a chance to prevail. Judge Lawson's office felt smaller than usual as Daniel Garrett sat rigidly in the leather chair across from him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds, striping the desk between them like prison bars. Tension filled the air like a heavy blanket, making the room feel stifling despite the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Garrett's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white with strain. The betrayal of being investigated still showed clearly on his face, in the tight set of his jaw and the hurt in his eyes. His firefighter's uniform, usually a source of pride, seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders today. Lawson carefully slid the fire report across his polished desk. The manila folder made a soft scratching sound against the wood, like whispered secrets. "Tell me what you remember about that night," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving Garrett's face. Garrett stared at the folder for a long moment before reaching for it with slightly trembling hands. He took a deep breath that seemed to rattle in his chest, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion and memories he'd rather forget. "I was the first firefighter inside. The place was nearly gone." He closed his eyes, remembering. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see 3 feet ahead. The heat was incredible, even through our gear. It felt like walking into hell itself. His fingers traced the edge of the report unconsciously, as if touching the paper could somehow change what was written there. "I heard crying. Faint but there. I followed it to a bedroom." He swallowed hard, his throat working. "Found a baby in a crib. Ava May. She was so small, so helpless." Lawson leaned forward slightly, his chair creaking beneath him. "And the door?" "That's what was weird," Garrett said, opening his eyes, the memory sharp and clear. The door was locked, from the outside. His brow furrowed deeply, the pieces finally falling into place. "I had to kick it down to get in. The sound of it splintering still haunts me." Lawson's hands slowly curled into fists on his desk, his knuckles whitening against the dark wood. "That means someone trapped Maria Carter inside." The words fell between them like stones. The weight of this realization seemed to press down on both men. Garrett nodded slowly, his face pale as chalk. "I didn't know she had died until later. We were focused on getting the baby out." He ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly aged. "God, I should have realized something was wrong back then. The signs were all there." "The door being locked wasn't in the official report," Lawson noted, his voice tight with controlled anger that made the words sharp as glass. "No," Garrett agreed quietly. "I mentioned it to the fire marshal, but he said it wasn't relevant to the cause of death." He looked up at Lawson, his eyes haunted by the ghosts of that night. "Someone wanted her dead, didn't they?" Lawson and Garrett shared a long, tense look across the desk. The truth hung heavy between them. Maria Carter hadn't died in an accident. She had been murdered. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the office floor, as if trying to hide from the darkness they'd just uncovered. The night was still, broken only by the sudden, piercing scream that echoed through the foster home. Ava May thrashed in her small bed, her yellow blanket twisted around her tiny legs like a serpent. Sweat matted her dark curls to her forehead as she fought against invisible demons in her sleep, her small hands batting at the air. Her temporary foster mother, Mrs. Bennett, rushed into the room, flicking on the bedside lamp. "Sweetheart, wake up," she called softly, reaching for the trembling child. "You're having a bad dream. It's okay. You're safe here." Ava May's eyes flew open, wild with terror. She scrambled backward until her small back hit the headboard with a thud, her chest heaving with sobs. "No, no, no," she whimpered, pulling her knees to her chest. Her fingers clutched desperately at the fabric of her nightgown. Mrs. Bennett tried to comfort her, moving slowly closer with outstretched arms, but Ava May only cried harder, burying her face in her hands. Nothing seemed to calm her, not the gentle words, not the soft touch, not even the nightlight casting its warm glow across the room. The next morning, Judge Lawson arrived early, his face creased with concern when Mrs. Bennet told him about the night's events. He found Ava May sitting in the corner of the living room, clutching her worn teddy bear like a shield. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, dark circles underneath them telling the story of her sleepless night. She looked so small against the floral wallpaper, like a wounded bird. The moment she saw him, Ava May jumped up and ran to him, her small fingers gripping his coat desperately. He could feel her trembling against him, her whole body shaking like a leaf in the wind. "I saw him," she whispered, her voice barely audible, breath warm against his collar. "The man with the scar." Lawson felt his body go rigid, every muscle tensing at once. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to her eye level, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Sweetheart, what man?" Ava May's lower lip quivered. She struggled to find the words, her small face scrunched in concentration, eyes distant as if watching a replay of something terrible. Then, slowly, she lifted her tiny hand to her cheek. With one finger, she traced a line from her temple down to her jaw, mimicking a long scar. The gesture was deliberate, precise. Too precise for a child's imagination. The judge watched her carefully, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was the first real clue they had, a detail that could help them understand what really happened that terrible night. A piece of the puzzle they'd been desperately searching for. "Did you see him?" Lawson paused, choosing his words carefully, not wanting to push too hard. "The night of the fire?" Ava May's eyes filled with fresh tears, turning them glassy in the morning light. She nodded, clutching her teddy bear tighter against her chest, as if trying to disappear into its soft fur. Lawson knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "You're safe now," he whispered, though his gut twisted with the knowledge that somewhere out there, a man with a scar was walking free, a man who might hold the key to Maria Carter's death. The weight of this revelation settled heavily on his shoulders, adding another layer to the already complex case that kept him awake at night. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead in Detective Mitchell's cramped office, casting harsh shadows on the stacks of files lining the walls. Judge Lawson leaned forward in his chair, his tie loosened after hours of poring over case files, the fabric wrinkled from his constant fidgeting. The thick folder labeled Crowley Jacob sat between them like a ticking bomb, its edges worn from countless hands. Detective Mitchell ran his weathered hands over the documents spread across his desk, his fingers trembling slightly with exhaustion. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten in the intensity of their investigation, the dark liquid reflecting the dim office lights. "There's something here you need to see," he said, pulling out a worn photograph that had clearly been handled many times. Crowley didn't work alone. Never did. Lawson's eyes narrowed as Mitchell slid the photo across the desk, disturbing loose papers in its wake. "Meet Marcus Dean," Mitchell continued, his voice dropping lower. "Crowley's muscle man. Did all the dirty work when things needed handling, the kind of man who enjoys his job too much." The photo showed a hard-faced man with cold eyes and, most notably, a deep scar running down his left cheek, a jagged line that spoke of violence. Lawson's heart began to pound against his ribs. "The scar," he whispered, his throat suddenly dry. "This matches what Ava May described. Every detail." Mitchell nodded grimly, pulling out another file with practiced efficiency. "Dean's got quite the rap sheet. Arson, intimidation, assault." He tapped his finger on a particular entry, the paper crinkling under his touch. "He was suspected in 3 different fires, but we could never pin anything on him. The witnesses always disappeared or changed their stories, like clockwork." Lawson's mind raced back to the fire report, the details burning fresh in his memory. "Maria Carter was found in a locked room," he said slowly, each word heavy with realization. "The door was secured from the outside. She never had a chance." "Exactly," Mitchell agreed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Dean's signature move was making sure victims couldn't escape. He'd lock them in before setting the fire. Clean, efficient, cruel. He paused, letting the implications sink in. If Ava May saw him that night... She's a witness, Lawson finished, his stomach churning with dread. She saw the man who killed her mother. She's been carrying that memory all this time. Mitchell pulled out more photos. Surveillance shots showing Dean and Crowley together outside various buildings, their body language speaking of familiarity and shared purpose. They worked as a team. Crowley would identify vulnerable families through the foster system, and Dean would eliminate any problems, like taking out the trash, to them. Lawson stared at the evidence before him, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. Maria Carter filed a complaint about suspicious activities in child welfare services. She was trying to expose them. She must have discovered something big. And a week later, she died in a house fire, Mitchell added grimly, his jaw clenching. The complaint mysteriously vanished from the system. Not a trace left. The weight of understanding settled heavy in the room like a suffocating blanket. Ava May's terror wasn't about Daniel Garrett at all. She had recognized Dean's face from the night her mother died. Her young mind had mixed up the warnings, but her mother's last words now made perfect sense. Don't let him take her. Mitchell gathered the files with urgent precision, his movements sharp with purpose. We need to move fast. If Dean knows Ava May can identify him... He left the threat unspoken. Find him, Lawson ordered, his voice hard with determination, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Find Marcus Dean now, before he finds her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds in Judge Lawson's office, creating stark lines across Daniel Garrett's tired face. His shoulders slumped under the weight of everything they'd uncovered. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with unspoken fears. I need to ask you again about the night of the fire, Lawson said, his voice gentle but firm. He'd learned to read people over his years on the bench, and right now, Garrett looked like a man carrying a crushing burden. Garrett sighed, running a calloused hand through his disheveled hair. I already told you. Did you see anyone else that night? Lawson cut in, leaning forward in his leather chair. A man with a scar? The question hit Garrett like a physical blow. His body went rigid, and his eyes widened slightly. His fingers gripped the arms of his chair as memory washed over him. I remember a guy standing near the fire truck, watching. Could it have been Marcus Dean? Lawson pressed, his own hands tightening on his armrests. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Garrett's face twisted in concentration. I don't know, it was dark, smoky, but there was something off about him. He wasn't panicked like everyone else, just watching. Like he was making sure of something. He paused, swallowing hard. If Ava May remembers him, she's in danger. His voice cracked on the last word, fear and anger mixing in his tone. Lawson nodded slowly, watching as the realization settled over Garrett. This wasn't just about an adoption anymore. This wasn't about hurt feelings or misunderstandings. This was about a little girl who might have witnessed something terrible, something that could still put her life at risk. Garrett's face hardened with determination. His fist came down hard on Lawson's desk, making the coffee cup rattle. I need to protect my daughter. The words echoed in the quiet office. Not foster daughter or Ava May, just my daughter. Simple, definitive. Despite everything that had happened in the courtroom, despite Ava May's fear and rejection, Garrett's love for her hadn't wavered. If anything, it had grown stronger with the knowledge that she might be in danger. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 3A, casting a soft glow across the polished wooden benches. Judge Lawson sat at his bench, his usual commanding presence tempered by gentle concern as he watched the doors open. Daniel Garrett sat quietly in the front row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights, but there was a glimmer of hope in his expression. The courtroom was nearly empty today, just the essential personnel and a few officers standing guard. When the side door opened, Ava May entered with her caseworker, Sarah Miller. The little girl wore a pink dress with tiny butterflies, her dark hair neatly braided. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, deliberately avoiding looking in Garrett's direction. Sarah guided her to a chair near the judge's bench, far enough from Garrett to make the child feel safe. Judge Lawson stepped down from his bench, moving with careful deliberation. He knelt beside Ava Mae's chair, his normally stern features softening. "Ava Mae, sweetheart, I need to show you something." His voice was gentle, barely above a whisper. From a manila envelope, he withdrew a single photograph and placed it on the small table in front of her. The image showed a man with hard eyes and a distinctive scar running down his left cheek, Marcus Dean's mugshot. Ava Mae's tiny hands began to shake. Her bottom lip quivered as she stared at the photograph, and tears welled up in her wide brown eyes. The color drained from her face as recognition dawned. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, she nodded her head. "That's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tears spilled down her cheeks, leaving wet trails on her skin. From his seat, Garrett's hands curled into tight fists, his jaw clenched as understanding washed over him. He looked at Judge Lawson, his voice thick with emotion. "That's who she's afraid of, not me." The revelation hung heavy in the air. Sarah Miller placed a comforting hand on Ava Mae's shoulder as the little girl continued to cry quietly. Judge Lawson stood, his expression hardening as he returned to his bench. He lifted his gavel, bringing it down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. "This case isn't over," he declared firmly. "We need to find Marcus Dean." The afternoon light streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across courtroom 3A. The room was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustling of papers. Judge Lawson leaned forward slightly in his chair, watching the scene unfold before him with careful attention. Daniel Garrett moved slowly like someone approaching a frightened deer. He knelt beside Ava Mae's chair, his weathered hands trembling slightly. The little girl sat rigid, her yellow dress wrinkled from clutching it too tightly. "Sweetheart," Garrett whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you know who saved you that night?" Ava Mae's big brown eyes darted between Garrett and Judge Lawson, uncertainty written across her small features. She didn't speak, but she didn't pull away either. With careful movements, Garrett reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. The edges were slightly curled, like it had been handled many times. He held it out where Ava Mae could see it clearly. In the photo, a younger Garrett stood in his full firefighter gear, his face smudged with soot but wearing a relieved smile. In his arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a smoke-stained blanket, a baby, no more than a few months old. Even in the faded picture, you could see the infant's dark curls, just like Ava Mae's. The little girl stared at the photograph, her eyes growing wider. Her small fingers reached out, touching the edge of the picture. She looked at the baby in the blanket, then up at Garrett's face, then back at the photo again. Something flickered in her expression, a spark of recognition. Her breath caught in her throat as she lifted her tiny hand to Garrett's face, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saved me?" Tears spilled down Garrett's cheeks as he nodded. "Yes, baby girl. I did." Judge Lawson watched silently from his bench as the moment unfolded, his own throat tight with emotion. He could see the walls of fear crumbling in Ava Mae's eyes, replaced by something new, understanding. Ava Mae's small fingers moved from Garrett's face to his sleeve, gripping the fabric tightly. "You saved me," she whispered again. But this time it wasn't a question. Her voice was filled with wonder and relief, like she'd finally found something she'd been looking for all along. The evening sun cast long shadows across the front porch of Daniel Garrett's modest two-story home. His hands were shaking slightly as he watched the caseworker's car pull into the driveway. Through the passenger window, he could see Ava Mae's small face, her dark curls framing her uncertain expression. The caseworker, Ms. Thompson, opened the car door and helped Ava Mae out. The little girl clutched a well-loved stuffed bunny to her chest, its floppy ears showing signs of frequent hugging. Her yellow dress from the courthouse had been replaced with pink overalls and a white t-shirt, but her nervousness remained the same. Garrett's heart thundered in his chest as they approached the front steps. This was the moment he'd been both hoping for and dreading since that day in court. Each step Ava Mae took seemed to last an eternity. When they reached the porch, Garrett knelt down, making himself smaller, less intimidating. The wooden boards creaked under his weight. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice gentle and encouraging. "This is your home." Ava Mae stood at the threshold, one hand gripping her bunny while the other held onto Miss Thompson's sleeve. Her wide brown eyes darted around the entryway, taking in the familiar surroundings she'd been away from for what felt like forever. Something caught her attention, a glint of silver on the fireplace mantel. She took a tentative step forward, then another. There, in a simple silver frame, sat a photograph of herself as a baby. In it, she was wearing a tiny pink dress, her first tooth showing in a gummy smile. Next to it were other photos. Ava Mae taking her first steps, blowing out birthday candles, playing in autumn leaves. Her small lips parted in surprise. "You kept me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Garrett felt tears welling up in his eyes. He swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. "Always," he managed to say. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ava Mae's fingers tightened around her stuffed bunny as she took another small step into the house. The hardwood floors creaked softly under her tiny shoes, a familiar sound that seemed to comfort her. Ms. Thompson stood quietly by the door, her presence reassuring but unobtrusive. She watched as Ava Mae continued her careful exploration of the space, clutching her bunny like a shield against her uncertainty. Each step Ava Mae took was measured and cautious, but they were steps forward nonetheless. Her eyes kept returning to the photos on the mantel, as if drawing strength from the visual proof of Garrett's enduring love for her. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow across the wooden table. Daniel Garrett stood at the stove, carefully pouring batter onto the griddle, making sure each pancake was perfectly round. The familiar sizzle and sweet aroma filled the kitchen, just like it had every Saturday morning before everything changed. He glanced over his shoulder at Ava Mae, who sat quietly at the table in her pink pajamas with tiny unicorns on them. Her stuffed bunny rested in her lap, and she watched him with cautious eyes. "Almost ready, sweetheart," Garrett said softly, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. His heart ached as he remembered how she used to stand on her little step stool beside him, giggling as he let her help pour the batter. When the stack was ready, he arranged them carefully on her favorite plate, the blue one with silver stars around the edge. He added a small pat of butter and drizzled maple syrup in the swirling pattern she always loved, then placed it gently in front of her. Ava Mae just stared at the plate, her tiny fingers fidgeting with her bunny's ears. The silence in the kitchen felt heavy, broken only by the quiet ticking of the wall clock. Garrett sat down across from her, his own plate untouched. He watched as she slowly picked up her fork, turning it over in her small hand as if remembering how to use it. Finally, she cut off a tiny piece and lifted it to her mouth. The moment she took that first bite, something changed in her expression. Her eyes widened slightly, and she lowered her fork. "Mama used to make these," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Garrett's throat tightened, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "She must have been a great cook." Ava Mae nodded, still looking at her plate. "She put chocolate chips in them sometimes," she said softly, as if sharing a precious secret. "Would you like chocolate chips in yours next time?" Garrett asked gently, careful not to push too hard. She looked up at him then, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in days. A small nod, then she took another bite of her pancake, this time without hesitation. Garrett watched as she continued eating, his own breakfast forgotten. Each bite seemed to bring back a piece of the trust they'd once shared, as fragile as morning sunlight on dewdrops. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft clink of her fork against the plate, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the tense silence of fear, but the peaceful quiet of a new beginning. Judge Ethan Lawson's office was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustling of papers. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the Venetian blinds, creating golden stripes across his polished oak desk. The judge methodically reviewed each document in the thick manila folder before him, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. Across the desk, Daniel Garrett sat with his back straight, hands clasped tightly in his lap. Though his rugged face showed signs of exhaustion from sleepless nights, his eyes held a new spark of hope. The past few weeks had transformed him. The defeat in his shoulders had been replaced by quiet determination. "I've been over every detail," Lawson said, his deep voice breaking the silence. He removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the desk. "The investigation into Maria's death is ongoing, but one thing is clear." He paused, meeting Garrett's anxious gaze. "I've reviewed all the evidence. Garrett, you're the only father Ava Mae has ever known." Garrett leaned forward, his voice thick with emotion. "She's my daughter, Judge. I don't care what it takes." His fingers gripped the armrests of his chair. "I'll spend every day proving to her that she's safe with me." Judge Lawson nodded slowly, reaching for his official stamp. The sound of it pressing against the final adoption motion echoed in the quiet room. Each subsequent document received the same treatment. Firm, decisive stamps that represented years of love and dedication finally being recognized by law. Garrett watched, barely breathing, as Lawson signed the last page with a flourish. When the judge set down his pen, Garrett exhaled sharply, years of tension releasing from his shoulders. The relief on his face was palpable, his eyes growing misty. Lawson stood, straightening his robes, and extended his hand across the desk. "Congratulations, Mr. Garrett." The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 3A, casting a warm glow across the polished wooden benches. The room was packed, but everyone sat in respectful silence. Judge Lawson's familiar face held a gentle expression as he looked down from his bench at the little girl in the yellow dress. Ava Mae Carter stood beside Daniel Garrett, her tiny hand wrapped in his much larger one. Her dark curls were neatly tied back with a ribbon that matched her dress, and her brown eyes were wide but no longer filled with fear. Garrett knelt beside her, his weathered firefighter's hands holding hers with infinite tenderness. "Ava Mae." Judge Lawson's voice was soft but carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. "Do you want Daniel Garrett to be your father?" The little girl's gaze moved from the judge to Garrett's face. She studied him intently, her small brows furrowed in concentration. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity to those watching. Garrett held his breath, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Tears welled up in Ava Mae's eyes, but these weren't tears of fear like before. Her lips trembled slightly as she nodded, and then in a clear voice that rang through the silent courtroom, she said, "Yes." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. Someone in the back sniffled loudly. Garrett's eyes filled with tears he couldn't hold back, one escaping down his cheek as he squeezed Ava Mae's hand gently. Judge Lawson's face broke into a warm smile as he picked up his stamp. The sound of it hitting the final decree seemed to echo off the courtroom walls. "Daniel Garrett," he announced, his voice full of warmth, "you are now legally Ava Mae Carter's father." The words had barely left the judge's mouth when Ava Mae turned and launched herself into Garrett's arms. He caught her and lifted her up, holding her close against his chest. Her small arms wrapped around his neck as he cradled her, his tears now flowing freely. "I love you, sweetheart," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll always keep you safe." Ava Mae buried her face in his shoulder, clinging to him tightly as applause erupted throughout the courtroom. The sound swelled, filling the space with joy and celebration, marking the moment when fear finally gave way to love, and a family was made whole. The afternoon sunlight painted golden streaks across courtroom 3A, warming the polished wooden benches where dozens of people sat, holding their breath. The air felt charged with emotion, as Judge Ethan Lawson adjusted his reading glasses and picked up the heavy gavel that had seen countless decisions before. Ava Mae's tiny fingers remained firmly wrapped around Daniel Garrett's hand, her yellow dress bright against his dark suit. Her brown eyes, no longer clouded with fear, watched the judge intently. Judge Lawson's voice carried clearly through the hushed room. "It is the decision of this court that Daniel Garrett is now, in all legal respects, the father of Ava Mae Carter." The sharp crack of the gavel echoed off the high ceiling, making it official. A collective release of emotion swept through the courtroom. Sniffles and quiet gasps filled the air as Garrett dropped to his knees beside Ava Mae. His arms trembled slightly as he pulled her close, enveloping her small frame in a gentle embrace. She pressed her face into his chest, her voice barely a whisper, but clear enough to break every heart in the room. "Daddy." Tears spilled freely down Garrett's cheeks as he held her, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other supported her back. He didn't try to hide his emotion, couldn't have even if he wanted to. This little girl who had once recoiled from him in terror was finally, officially his daughter. The court clerk dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The stenographer paused in her typing, touched by the scene before her. Even the usually stoic bailiff cleared his throat and looked away, blinking rapidly. Judge Lawson watched from his bench, his stern features softening as he observed the newly formed family. He'd seen countless adoptions in his career, but something about this one, about the journey these two had taken to reach this moment, struck a particularly deep chord. The social worker who had supervised their recent visits smiled through her tears, clutching her folder to her chest. She remembered how uncertain these moments had seemed just weeks ago, when Ava May had been too frightened to even look at Garrett. Garrett shifted, starting to stand, and Ava May's arms immediately wrapped around his neck. He lifted her easily, naturally, as if they'd never been apart. She settled against his shoulder, her small body relaxing completely in his arms. Her eyes drifted closed, secure in the knowledge that she was finally, truly home. The late afternoon sun caught the tears on Garrett's cheeks as he held his daughter, creating tiny prisms of light. The courtroom remained silent, bearing witness to this precious moment when fear gave way to love, when uncertainty transformed into belonging, when a father and daughter found their way back to each other. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Daniel Garrett's modest two-story house as he carried Ava May up the front steps. His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the keys, trying to balance both them and his precious daughter. After everything they'd been through, she was finally home, really home. Ava May's head rested against his shoulder, her eyes heavy with exhaustion from the emotional day, but still alert enough to take in her surroundings. The house smelled like fresh paint and pine cleaner. Garrett had spent days preparing for this moment, making sure everything was perfect. "Here we are, sweetheart," he said softly, pushing the door open. The entrance hallway glowed warm and inviting in the evening light. Garrett set her down gently on her feet, his heart swelling as she took tentative steps into the living room. Her small hand trailed along the wall, touching everything within reach as if to make sure it was real. She paused at the bookshelf where colorful children's books were mixed with photo albums. "This is your home," Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion. He watched as she explored, her yellow dress swishing around her knees as she moved from shelf to shelf. Then she stopped, frozen in place. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a collection of framed photographs. In the center was a picture of Garrett in his firefighter uniform, cradling a tiny baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. It was Ava May, just days after he'd become her foster father. Her small fingers reached up to touch the glass, leaving tiny prints behind. "You really kept me?" she whispered, her voice full of wonder and uncertainty. Garrett knelt beside her, his heart aching at the doubt in her voice. "Every single day," he answered, fighting back tears. "From the very first moment, you were my little girl." Around the central photo were others, Ava May taking her first steps, covered in birthday cake on her second birthday, playing in autumn leaves. Every milestone, every precious moment, carefully preserved and displayed with pride. "See?" Garrett pointed to each picture. "That's you learning to walk, and there you are at the park. You loved the swing so much you'd cry when we had to leave." Ava May's eyes widened as she took in each photograph, each piece of evidence that she had always been loved, always been wanted. Her small hand moved from frame to frame, touching each one as if to make sure they were real. The tension in her tiny shoulders began to melt away as understanding dawned in her young mind. This wasn't just a house. It was her home. These weren't just pictures. They were memories. And this man beside her wasn't just someone who wanted to adopt her. He was her father, had been her father all along. She turned to look at him, her brown eyes shining with tears that matched his own. Without a word, she reached up and took his hand in hers, her tiny fingers wrapping around his with complete trust. In that simple gesture, Garrett felt years of worry and fear dissolve. His daughter was home, and she finally knew she belonged. Sunlight streamed through the lavender curtains, casting a soft glow across Ava Mae's new bedroom. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment confusion clouded her face. The ceiling was different from the foster home, higher, with tiny glow-in-the-dark stars scattered across it. The bed felt different too, softer, with sheets that smelled like fresh flowers. The sound of familiar footsteps in the hallway made her heart skip. Not with fear this time, but with something new. Anticipation. She recognized those steps now. They belonged to someone safe. Garrett's head appeared around the doorframe, his smile warm and gentle. "Good morning, sunshine?" His voice was soft, careful not to startle her. Ava Mae rubbed her sleepy eyes with tiny fists, and then something wonderful happened. She smiled. Not the hesitant, uncertain smiles from before, but a real one that lit up her whole face. Garrett stepped fully into the room carrying a wooden tray. The smell of fresh pancakes wafted through the air, making Ava Mae's stomach rumble. Her eyes widened as she saw the stack of golden brown circles, topped with butter and drizzled with maple syrup. 2 strawberries sat on the side, arranged to look like a heart. "For me?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. The simple question held so much more meaning. Was this kindness really meant for her? Garrett chuckled warmly, setting the tray carefully across her lap. "Always," he replied, and that single word carried the weight of a promise. Ava Mae stared at the breakfast, taking in every detail. The way the syrup made little pools on the plate, the perfect golden brown color of the pancakes, the small fork placed just so on a folded napkin. This wasn't just breakfast, it was proof that someone cared enough to make everything special, just for her. She picked up the fork, its weight familiar in her small hand. The first bite of pancake melted in her mouth, sweet and warm and perfect. Looking up at Garrett, she grinned, a bit of syrup glistening on her chin. Judge Lawson sat at his mahogany desk, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he studied a thick case file. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through his office window, making the dust motes dance in the air. A gentle knock at his door made him look up. There in the doorway stood Daniel Garrett, and beside him, holding his hand tightly, was Ava Mae. She wore a pretty blue dress with white flowers, her dark hair neatly braided. But what struck Lawson most was her posture, straight and confident, no longer shrinking or trying to hide. "Judge Lawson," Garrett said softly, "we wanted to stop by." Lawson stood, straightening his robes. His eyes met Ava Mae's, and he saw something there he hadn't seen before. Peace. Gone was the terror that had haunted her young face during that first dramatic court hearing. Ava Mae took small, sure steps into the office, her hand still firmly clasped in Garrett's. But this time, she didn't duck behind anyone. She didn't tremble or try to escape. Instead, she looked directly at the judge, her brown eyes clear and steady. "Thank you for saving me too," she whispered, her voice small but certain. The words hit Lawson like a physical force. He'd heard thousands of cases, dealt with countless children, maintained his professional demeanor through the most heart-wrenching situations. But something about this little girl's simple gratitude made his throat tight and his eyes burn. He knelt down to her level, his black robes pooling around him on the floor. A smile crossed his face, not the stern, judicial smile he usually wore, but something softer, more genuine. "You saved yourself, sweetheart," he said gently, his voice rougher than usual with emotion. "You were brave enough to speak up when you were scared. You helped us understand what really happened." Ava Mae tilted her head, considering his words. Then, without warning, she stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around the judge's neck in a tight hug. Lawson froze for a moment, surprised by the gesture before gently returning the embrace. The kitchen was warm and cozy, filled with the comforting aroma of melting cheese and the gentle hum of the oven fan. Ava Mae sat at the wooden table, her legs swinging back and forth beneath her chair, not quite reaching the floor. Her eyes followed Garrett's movements as he moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, pulling out plates and checking the oven timer. She clutched her favorite stuffed bunny in her lap, but her grip was relaxed now, not desperate like before. The evening sun streamed through the window, casting a golden glow across the kitchen tiles and making her dark hair shine. Garrett opened the oven, and the smell of perfectly baked macaroni and cheese filled the air. He pulled out a serving dish full of bubbling cheese and perfectly crispy breadcrumbs on top. Next to the stove, golden brown chicken nuggets waited on a plate. With careful movements, he prepared her plate, making sure the macaroni and cheese wasn't too hot. He arranged the chicken nuggets just the way she liked them, in a circle around the edge of the plate. When he set it in front of her, Ava Mae's eyes lit up with pure joy. She clapped her hands together, bouncing slightly in her seat. "You remembered!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with wonder and delight. Garrett chuckled warmly as he sat down across from her with his own plate. "Of course I did, baby girl." His heart swelled as he watched her pick up her fork without any hesitation or fear. She took a big bite, humming happily as she chewed. The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle clink of forks against plates and Ava Mae's occasional happy sighs. Halfway through the meal, she paused, looking up at Garrett with those big brown eyes that could melt his heart in an instant. "Daddy," she said softly, and Garrett's breath caught in his throat. That word, so simple yet so precious, still had the power to make his heart skip a beat. He smiled, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, sweetheart." She tilted her head to one side, a serious expression on her small face. "Do we get to keep each other forever now?" Tears welled up in Garrett's eyes before he could stop them. He reached across the table, gently taking her tiny hand in his much larger one. Her fingers were warm and sticky from the macaroni and cheese, but he didn't care. "Forever," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "You and me, baby girl. Forever." Ava Mae giggled, giving his hand a little squeeze. Then she turned back to her dinner, happily munching away on her chicken nuggets, completely at peace in her home, with her daddy. The morning sunlight streamed through Ava Mae's bedroom window, casting a warm glow on her yellow dress with tiny flowers. She stood in front of the full-length mirror, her small hands carefully smoothing down the fabric. Her dark curls were neatly tied back with matching yellow ribbons that Garrett had learned to tie after watching countless YouTube tutorials. Garrett knelt beside her, his large hands gentle as he adjusted the straps of her pink backpack. "Not too tight?" he asked, watching her face in the mirror. "It's good," she whispered, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. The drive to preschool was unusually quiet. Ava Mae sat in her car seat, clutching her stuffed bunny and staring out the window. The usual morning chatter about breakfast and her favorite cartoons was missing. Garrett glanced at her through the rearview mirror, noting how she bit her lower lip, a habit she shared with her mother. As they pulled into the preschool parking lot, the playground was already alive with activity. Children chased each other around the colorful equipment, their laughter carrying through the car windows. Ava Mae's grip on her bunny tightened. Garrett parked the car and turned around in his seat. "Are you nervous, sweetheart?" She nodded slowly, her brown eyes wide with uncertainty. "What if they don't like me?" The vulnerability in her voice made Garrett's heart ache. He unbuckled his seatbelt and moved to the back seat, taking her small hands in his. They felt so tiny, so precious in his weathered firefighter's palms. "Sweetheart," he said softly, looking directly into her eyes, "you are kind, brave, and so loved. They're going to love you. And even if they don't, I always will." A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him. "Promise?" "Cross my heart," Garrett said, making an X over his chest that made her giggle. The sound of her laughter, still rare but becoming more frequent, filled the car with warmth. Ava Mae hugged her bunny one more time before carefully placing it in her backpack, leaving just its head peeking out. Garrett stepped out and opened her door. Ava Mae took a deep breath, her tiny shoulders squaring with determination. She reached for his hand, and together they stepped away from the car. The soft glow of Ava Mae's nightlight filled her bedroom with warm shadows, as Garrett tucked the pink comforter around her small body. Her stuffed bunny, worn from years of love, remained clutched tightly in her arms. Her eyelids were heavy, but she fought sleep, watching Garrett with those big brown eyes that held so much trust now. "Time for sleep, sweetheart," Garrett said softly, smoothing back a stray curl from her forehead. Ava Mae shifted under the covers, her tiny fingers playing with her bunny's ears. "Can you tell me a bedtime story?" Her voice was small, but steady. Garrett's heart swelled. He settled onto the edge of her bed, his weight making the mattress dip slightly. "Of course. What would you like to hear?" She yawned, her eyes still fixed on his face. "Tell me about the day you saved me." Garrett's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this request, but he could see the trust in her eyes. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. "It was a very dark night," he began, his voice gentle. "I was working at the fire station when we got the call. I remember running into that house, searching through the smoke." He paused, carefully choosing his words. "And then I heard something, the tiniest cry. That's when I found you, so small in your crib." Ava Mae listened intently, her eyes wide despite her sleepiness. Her tiny hand reached out and found his larger one, holding on tight. "You were wrapped in a little yellow blanket," Garrett continued, squeezing her hand gently. "I picked you up, held you close, and carried you outside to safety. You were so brave even then." "I don't remember all of it," Ava Mae whispered, her voice drowsy. "But I know I was safe." Her fingers tightened around his hand. "You made me safe." Garrett felt tears prick at his eyes. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "You'll always be safe now, baby girl." Ava Mae's eyes fluttered closed, a small smile on her face as sleep finally began to claim her. Her grip on his hand remained strong, even as her breathing evened out. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the heater, its warmth spreading through the rooms like a protective blanket. Ava Mae's eyes fluttered open in the darkness, her heart racing for a moment, before she remembered where she was. This wasn't the scary place from her nightmares. This was home. She lay still in her bed, listening carefully. No strange footsteps, no unfamiliar voices, no scary sounds that made her want to hide. Just the peaceful rhythm of the heater, and if she listened very carefully, the soft sound of Garrett's breathing down the hall. Clutching her stuffed bunny close to her chest, Ava Mae slipped out from under her covers. Her tiny feet touched the carpet, and she padded quietly down the hallway, the bunny's ears dragging along beside her. The nightlight in the hall cast a gentle glow, making friendly shadows that didn't frighten her anymore. She reached Garrett's door and hesitated, her small hand resting against the wood. Slowly, carefully, she pushed it open just enough to peek inside. Garrett lay sleeping peacefully, one arm draped across his chest, his face relaxed. He looked strong even in sleep, like someone who could keep all the bad things away. Taking a deep breath, Ava Mae tiptoed to the side of his bed. She climbed up carefully, trying not to wake him, her bunny still held tight in one hand. The mattress shifted slightly under her weight, and Garrett stirred but didn't wake. She settled down beside him, pulling a corner of his blanket over herself. As if sensing her presence, Garrett's arm moved instinctively, wrapping around her small body and drawing her close. The warmth of his embrace surrounded her, and for the first time in her young life, Ava Mae felt completely and utterly safe. She snuggled against his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. In that moment, memories washed over her. Not the scary ones, but the good ones. She remembered strong arms carrying her through smoke, a gentle voice telling her everything would be okay. "I remember now," she whispered into the darkness. "You saved me." Garrett stirred slightly, his voice thick with sleep as he murmured, "And I always will." The house settled into peaceful silence, wrapping father and daughter in its quiet embrace. If you enjoyed the story of Ava, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.